Well, how are you doing today? Today we're going to talk about Saxon, Course 2, Lesson 12. And today's topic is problems about comparing and elapsed time problems. Now, these are really not all that hard, but sometimes people get confused when they try to look at them, especially if they're written as a word problem. So let's see if we can get a little bit of the mystery out of it. We need a few definitions, as we always do. Comparing. When you're comparing, you're implying how much greater or how much less something is. If you were looking at, let's say your mom gave you a piece of pizza and gave your sister a piece of pizza, and her pizza was remarkably larger than your pizza, you would be comparing the two of them. Okay? Words that you're going to see are words like much, how much greater, how much less. And when you're looking at comparing, you will try to compute it this way. You will say the greater, whatever the greater is, minus the lesser is going to equal the difference. The greater minus the lesser will equal the difference. Now, another topic in this particular lesson has to do with elapsed time. And elapsed time is simply a difference between one time frame and another time frame. So the definition of elapsed time is the length of time between two dates. Now, I say dates because most of the time that's what you're going to be dealing with. But you could even be dealing with, minutes, hours, seconds. The difference between when third period gets over and when seventh period gets over, the elapsed time between those two periods. And then you would be dealing with time in minutes. When you're figuring elapsed time, you're going to take the later date minus the earlier date, and then that ends up to be equaling the difference. And I'm going to explain that a little bit more here in just a minute. But you need to write this down because when you're beginning to try to figure these kinds of problems out, this will be what you'll want to do. You want to take the later date, which is actually the date that's closer to you, and you're going to subtract the earlier date, the date that was farther away from your time right now. I'll show it on a number line. It'll make sense to you. And here is later date minus earlier date equals difference. Okay. Now, when we're comparing problems, I have already said this, but I want you to write this in your notes, is that we are looking at how much greater, you'll see these words, how much greater or how much less. How much greater or how much less. When you see that in a word, you know you're dealing with a comparing problem. Okay? The number that describes greater or less is actually the difference. We find that difference by subtracting the lesser number from the greater number. So you would take the lesser number, which is smaller, and you would subtract it from the greater number, which would be larger. And this is how it looks. Greater minus lesser equals difference. Greater minus lesser equals difference. Here's an example. The number 8,209 is how much less than 10,000? Okay, well, this is the greater number right here. This is the lesser number. To find the difference, we must... Yep, you got it. We've got to subtract. So this has got a lot of zeros, and this has been, I've found some people having some problems with this, so I really wanted to show this in the problem. So we'll start out, we can't borrow from here to get to there, and we can't take 9 from 0. We can't borrow from here to there to there. Can't borrow from here to there to there. So we go clear out here to begin our borrowing process. And since it's going to be 8 out of whatever that is, I'm going to change this to a 9. And then this goes to a 10 and it's changed to a 9. This goes to a 10 and it's changed to a 9 so that we can finally have 10 ones. 9 from 10 ones is 1. We have 9 tens. We have 9 hundreds minus 2 hundreds, so 9, 8, so that'd be 7 hundreds. And then we have 8,000 from 9,000, and that's 1. So the number 8,209 is how much less than 10,000? It is 1,791 less than 10,000. That makes sense to everybody? Alrighty. Now, I want to talk a little bit about elapsed time because this is a pretty short lecture today. It isn't going to take us too much time. Okay, elapsed time is the length of time between 2 points of time. Now that can be 2 times like in the 1700s and 2000s. It could be last April to this May. It could be, it could be big leaps of time or very small time. The difference between when you brush your teeth this morning and when you combed your hair. Okay, so we're going to start out, we're going to do something that's fairly simple here. Timelines are used a lot to find the difference between 2 periods of time. Usually people will put a timeline and they'll put a sequence of events on a timeline and they'll say, you know, how many years were there between the Civil War and the Vietnam War or something like that. And you would have to actually figure that out by, obviously, subtraction. The distance between the 2 events is the elapsed time. So I drew a timeline right here, and I didn't put what happened on these dates, but I think the timeline is sufficient. I'm going to blow that up just a tiny little bit so you can see it just a little better. Okay, so the earlier date, let's say, is 1900. I don't know what happened in 1900, but I'm sure it was exciting. The later date is 2020, which has not happened yet, okay? But I want to know what is the time that would be elapsed between 1900 and 2020. So here's our earlier date, 1900. Here's our later date, 2020. Time elapsed is whatever is in between these guys. Okay, does that make sense to y'all? I would hope so. All right, so to do that, we would want to take the later date, which is 2020, minus the earlier date, which is 1900. And what we find will be the difference, and that will actually be the elapsed time. Okay, so later date minus earlier date equals the difference. The difference is the elapsed time. Okay, so I'm going to take 2020 minus 1900, and I'm going to get 120, and I got my works over here on the right hand side. So the answer is there was 120 years between 1900 and 2020. And that pretty well covers lesson 12. If you have questions on this, please be sure that you ask in class or ask me while you're working on your homework. Have an awesome day, and I will talk to you later.